Welcome back to our series on Bach's Orgelbüchlein. And today we're looking at a great Easter hymn of rejoicing. Erstanden ist der heil'ge Christ. Bach, of course, treats us to a great impetuous chorale prelude of rejoicing with all those ascending scales, surely representative of resurrection. We've talked a good deal in this series about articulation and fingering, but I want to just return to it briefly today because it really is at the heart of our playing of these pieces. Now, at the risk of oversimplifying things, there was what is often referred to as a paradigm shift between the 18th century and the 19th century in terms of articulation theory and fingering theory. Of course, when we talk about this kind of thing, it doesn't mean that in the year 1800 there was suddenly a decree that everybody should do things differently, or even that everybody decided at more or less the same time. There was a gradual drift, naturally. So even as early as during Bach's lifetime, 1712, 1713, for instance, we see that he makes some changes to the way in which he does things. For example, that he starts to use the newfangled natural sign to cancel accidentals and this kind of thing. And various other stages along the way, we can see small changes. But at the same time, if we look at the time of Mendelssohn, for example, the 1830s, and compare it with the 1730s, we can see a really clear difference and a clear change, both in practical and in theoretical terms. So if we look at the 1830s end, the age of Mendelssohn, we get theorists like Czerny and Rink, who are exhorting organists actively to play with a legato style of playing, which is achieved specifically by means of the fingering, by means of passing the thumb under the first finger. This is referred to by them as our current time's way of playing. In other words, in contrast to what was done in previous generations. So they're very aware that this is the new way of playing. If we look a century earlier, we find that the basic articulation, the fundamental articulation that's taken for granted, is a non-legato one. That, as I've said before, doesn't mean detached. It simply means that there are graduations of articulation which form the way in which the notes flow. So this subtle graduation of emphases was shaped partly by the concept of strong and weak fingers corresponding to strong and weak notes within the beat, which reinforces the sense of beat and the primacy of the beat, and therefore puts into a highlight wherever the beat is diverted or altered to affect the music. This doesn't only apply to the hands, it applies to the feet as well. We've said before that Bach habitually writes his semiquavers, or at least the shorter note values, in such a way that they can all be played with alternate toes without any problem, whereas the quavers, or the longer note values, whichever it happens to be, very often can't, which suggests that the semiquavers have a different form of articulation to the quavers, and that the beats themselves are being highlighted also by that means. We've talked previously about historical versus modern fingering and pedalling, and I've made it very clear in this series that I don't want to prescribe the one or the other, and therefore I've been a little bit careful about saying what I do personally. But there are a number of things just to say here. First of all, so far as fingering is concerned, as I've said, the difference between Bach's fingering and Mendelssohn's fingering, for example, one of the very, very major elements of the difference is that in Bach's time, the thumb was not used to pass under the finger in order to create a legato which runs across different hand positions. It doesn't mean, of course, that the thumb isn't ever used. It was used at the beginnings and ends of scales, it was used in chords, it was used here and there. But it wasn't used for that purpose of creating a legato which runs across hand positions. And that's the big difference between the Bach's articulation or the Bach's fingering and, for example, Mendelssohn's fingering. And similarly with pedaling, I think that even if you decide to use heels as well as toes, you're likely to use at least 90% toes if you use the pedaling in such a way that you heighten the articulation of the beat, as we've described in terms of how Bach writes his semiquavers and his quavers. You know, I'm sometimes asked, was there a rule to say that you could use only toes in Bach's time? Well, that's not as simple a question as it might seem. So first of all, obviously there wasn't going to be a rule to say that you could use only toes if people used only toes, because there wouldn't need to be a rule for it. So how do we know that Bach used mostly toes? Well, there are a number of documents. For example, Carl Christian Kegel wrote in his tutor book for village organists in about 1830 that his teacher, Kittel, had said that Johann Sebastian Bach, who was his teacher in turn, had used toes. And that's a pretty good line of authority so far as they go. But at the same time, we can ask, what does that actually mean in practice? Let's take a rather absurd example. If, in the very unlikely event somebody were to ask one of my children in the future how I drank my coffee, they might say, well, yes, he always had a cup of coffee in the middle of the morning and ground his own beans every time. And that's true so far as it goes. But it doesn't mean that sometimes I didn't drink a cup of coffee out somewhere else. I did, in fact, this morning. And I didn't grind my own beans for that. Or if I'm out visiting some church somewhere, they often give me a cup of coffee and that's done in a completely different way. So, although it would be perfectly true and perfectly genuine and nearly accurate to say that I always ground my own coffee beans and always drank my coffee in the middle of the morning, it would nevertheless not preclude drinking coffee in other ways at different times of the day. So a statement can be both true and not inclusive at the same time. And so if somebody says, well, Bach always used his toes, we can take that as indicative of the way in which he went about playing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Bach never pressed a pedal with a heel, ever. Or even that he didn't play with a heel once in a line, just that it was very predominantly toes. And so it's really difficult to draw very firm conclusions from this kind of statement. Bach always used his toes. Yes, sure, he did. It doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't do anything else. But I think it's fair enough to say that Bach used overwhelmingly toes. And although I've said that I'm not going to say what I do, I will actually break my rule here and say that I do very much the same as that. I use overwhelmingly toes, but I don't feel that it's forbidden to use a heel here and there. But the important thing is that when we're using heels, then we are doing it not in order to create a legato where a legato isn't natural, but simply in order to facilitate what we're doing. So I think we need to bear in mind the basic articulation at all times, and how we bring that about is up to you. Now, we could have hours of fun talking about this, but these short films are really not the place for it. Go and read up what other people say about it, and go and do a bit of research and make up your own mind. But what does this particular piece tell us about the articulation? Well, first of all, articulation works at a number of levels here. So first of all, we have the chorale melody, which, as I've said before, is going to be legato across the top. And the chorale melody is a slow 3 in a bar. And the other articulation is going to emphasize that. So in particular, the pedals in this particular piece, we get the upbeat and then the long minim or semiquaver beat on the beat. So the pedals heighten that sense of once in a bar, the main beat of the 3, all the way through consistently. So the next level down is the minims themselves. And if you look at the crotchets, for example, in the accompanying part, in the inner part, they will naturally want to emphasize slightly the minim beats, which means that they will fall naturally into a slight pairing. And I don't mean slurring in 2s, I just mean that there will be a slight emphasis on the minim beats. Ba-dum, ba-dum, da-dum. And that is a very, very subtle way of articulating. So it's enough just to think the beats, and provided your fingering doesn't override what you're thinking about the articulation, which is the danger with modern fingering, then it will work out absolutely fine. The next layer down is the quavers, and there again the quavers want to heighten the minim beats, and so they will naturally fall into a slight pattern, which is part of the basic articulation technique for 18th century music in general. Again, it doesn't want to be overdone, but you will find that that works as a basic way of thinking about the quavers. And that really is all we need to think about in terms of the articulation. As I've said before, phrasing isn't really a term that we need to consider except in relation to the chorale melody, the lines of the chorale melody itself. It all comes down to this subtle, graduated articulation that heightens the beat and the flow as we go along. And that is the basis of 18th century playing technique. So if the strong fingers go on the strong beats, that helps us automatically to emphasize those strong beats. And this concept of emphasizing the beats, incidentally, is why the suspensions and other disruptions of the beat make such a big impression. So that alto D suspension in bar 14, for example, and the tenor A suspension in the following bar makes such a big impression when we play it this way, whereas if we were playing it entirely legato, they wouldn't be noticeable. So with Baroque articulation, they wave this huge flag to say, look, something is happening, in this particular case, the final cadence coming up. So we find that the various elements of the piece contribute to the structure in a different way. Well, that's more than enough talking. I think my basic message today is that the fundamental articulation of 18th century music is at the heart of everything we do. It applies to all the preludes in Orgelbüchlein, and it's really straightforward to understand. And it will shape and affect our playing of 18th century music in general. We're having a sudden change of scenery, and the reason is we're trying a little experiment. The background for this experiment is something which I said about in the episode we had on tempo. You may remember that we argued there that there can never be one tempo which is correct for one particular piece. The tempo is always going to depend on a lot of different circumstances. So there can be a lot of incorrect tempi on any particular day in any particular place. Some of the circumstances are the organ itself, the acoustics of the church, who is listening, where they're sitting, how one's feeling on the day, as well as the regular things which we take into account, such as the harmonic rhythm of the music itself. So very many things go together in determining a tempo. I told a little story, I think, in the episode on Tempe about one time when I played a broadcast for a national radio station in a church which had a very dry acoustic and a very beautiful modern Swedish organ. And because of the nature of the acoustic, because it was so dry, I played the music quite fast. And when the program was broadcast, I found, to my dismay, that the Broadcasting Corporation, without telling me, had added reverberation, which meant that it all sounded much too fast. And the lesson which I could draw from that was that circumstances can change your perception of the speed at which you're playing something. Those words really came back to bite me when I was making this episode. The talk which you've just heard was recorded in Wesenberg, and at the end of the talk I recorded the piece once. There wasn't time to do it several times because the church was in use for something else, and I had to get out at the end. For the same reason, because the church was being used for something else, we had to put the microphones right down at ground level by the altar, which is the opposite end of the church from the organ, and that is further away than we would normally choose to place microphones. I played the piece at a tempo which sounded entirely correct and reasonable from where I was sitting on the gallery. But, as I say, I had to leave, we had to pack up and go immediately afterwards, so there wasn't time to listen through to it. And when I got home and listened, I found that it sounded much too fast again. I'm sure you'll agree when you hear the piece in just a moment. And I wondered what I should do about that, and so came here to Björkreim Church, and I'm going to record it again one more time. And I'll try to play it at the same speed, and we can compare the two performances. They will be played in a very similar way, with a similar articulation, give or take the same speed, and different acoustics and different conditions. And you can just compare the two. Perhaps it's a good lesson for us all when we listen to recordings made by other people, and you think, yes, I think that was a little bit too fast or a little bit too slow for my taste. There can be all kinds of reasons for that. And perhaps the recording itself has not represented in a particularly good way what the player was aiming to do. And it's also a great lesson to us all that when you record something, it's a great idea to listen to it before you leave the church and pack it all in and say, yes, that's fine. So lots of lessons today. And here are two performances of the work. The first one in Wesenberg and the second one here in Björkreim Church.